a licensed social worker, certified clinical trauma professional, and grief counselor. Through Lifecare's Pathways of Hope, David works with individuals and organizations to provide support and resources for those working through grief. So again, that is our external reach. So that's a majority of who David works with are not hospice patients and families. His presentation today, Living Losses and Positive Coping in the Post-Pandemic Environment, will cover the following: common grief symptoms, the impact of grief on human functioning, what are living losses, and positive coping tools. So I'm pleased to call Dave a colleague and know you will get a lot of this for yourself and for your colleagues through this presentation.
Thanks, Catherine. It's an honor and a pleasure for me to be with you all today. And my goal for this presentation would be that you'd have some tools, some resources, and some perspective, I think, that can enhance both your own functioning and those that you love, because we're all grieving in various ways after having come through, and we're now in a post-pandemic environment. I guess I should start. I want to start with a few basic definitions. Can you see my screen okay? Living loss is defined, I'll define living loss as a loss we experience, or the losses we experience when there is no death. So we are familiar with the death losses, and they are straightforward. But in the case of living losses, it creates the same internal grief response without the attention. And so I think I'd like to highlight a little bit of that today. So this first slide is probably morose and glum, but I like to start with it to show the prevalence of stressors and even the environment that we live in. This slide is from a trauma training by Dr. Vanderkolk. And in short, I will not read all of these things, but he says that the United States is one of the most violent, stressed, and traumatized countries in the world. If you think about grief as the natural...
I don't think we're seeing your screen.
Ah, okay.
So it shows that it's paused.
Let me try that again. Thanks for that.
There we go. I can see it now.
All right, thank you. Thanks for clarifying that. By the way, I think you have a copy of this PowerPoint, and then also there is a handout that on stress that I think you have a copy of, and I'll reference. So, but in short, our environment is full of things that create grief, and grief is simply the natural human response to loss, and it represents all of our internal thoughts, feelings, emotions after a loss. So as you might imagine, in an environment where there are so many stressors, we are grieving, and we share the responses that go with grief. I love this quote by Robert Kavanaugh, and I think it pertains not just to this presentation, but to us and those we love. It says, deposits of grief, of unfinished grief, reside in more American hearts than I ever imagined. Until these pockets are opened and their contents aired openly, and this is the part that I like to highlight, they block unimagined amounts of human growth and potential. Grief does that. The natural responses we feel to loss can do that. And so the way this ends, this grief, this unaired or unopened grief, can give rise to bizarre and unexplained behavior, which causes untold internal stress. So again, this category of living loss impacts our functioning and behavior, but many times it's overlooked because there has not been a death. So I've already talked about this a little bit. Grief is just the natural human response to loss. And so it's not something that any of us can escape. And I think the good news about our stress response system and grief is whenever there is a loss, automatically we have an internal movement towards self-repair. But it's important to remember and know that we're grieving and that there's no timetable for that healing process. The thing I'd like to highlight from this slide, the second bullet point, or the bullet point on the bottom, living losses, or those losses we experience when there has not been a death, should be faced and mourned the same way as losses involving death. Can everybody hear me okay? Still? Here are a few examples of living losses. If someone moves, we may not think of that as a loss, but that will create a grief response because all of the norms, the environment that provided safety, comfort, etc., all of those connections have been disrupted. Although we are moving to hopefully a better or an upgraded situation, that still is a loss, and it can impact our functioning. Losing a job are other examples. Chronic health conditions. Again, there's no death, but there is a decline in functioning. And so again, those are examples of living losses. And the last one that I'll comment on are changes in family patterns. So the pandemic created that for everyone. It created those changes. It caused a loss in our normal routines, and it even shattered to some degree our assumptive world, right? There was a lot of unpredictability with what would happen next. All of those things create a grief response, that internal response. And so all of us have been touched by those things. Here are other examples of things that create an internal grief response. One of the things I would like to highlight in the DSM-5, the diagnostic statistical manual that is used for mental health diagnoses. For trauma, they upgraded it to, in this most recent edition, to say that our exposure to traumatic things can also be indirect, which means watching things on television or reading about them through social media and the newspaper can also create or activate our stress response system. And so here are examples of things of natural disasters and things that we all have been exposed to in various ways, levels. So exposure to loss, whether it's death loss or living loss. I talked about your assumptive world, and this more specifically explains what I mean. It creates that feeling. Living loss creates the feeling that things maybe aren't as safe as they used to be, or maybe I'm more vulnerable to a tragedy or a disaster of some sort than I used to be. So whether that is actual or perceived, a pandemic environment and living losses create that feeling. That feeling in turn gives rise to behaviors and things that impair our functioning. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. I like this picture because they say a picture's worth 1,000 words. And if you look at the expressions on each face, when we go through and experience loss, especially of our assumptive world and the norms that we have known, some of the things that create discord, dissent, and trouble, I think they melt away. And age no longer matters, and education and race and all of those things in the face of loss pale in comparison. And again, you see the expressions here. This is a photo from 9/11, and again, the impact of loss, that event, more than just the death losses, create the grief response due to living losses. Now, here's some common grief reactions. I will just go over and share a few of these, but one of the grief assessments that I commonly use, has 82 different grief symptoms. Here's why this is important. So you might find yourself, as you look at some of these common grief reactions, you may find yourself that you can check off some of these boxes since 2020, the incredible year that 2020 was. These are common grief reactions. And when we, like an earlier slide that I showed said, unless these things are mourned and opened and aired out, it creates this kind of disruption. So common grief reactions: sleep and appetite changes, sleeping more, sleeping less. Now, I will say this about each of these symptoms, and this is also in your handout. Some of these symptoms are in your handout regarding stress. These, you might say, David, I felt or I experienced a lot of these, or maybe most of these, prior to 2020. What we look for in grief and in bereavement: has there been an increase or a change in these symptoms since the loss, or in the case of the pandemic, since 2020? So if you can look back and say, well, 2019, when life was good and things were normal, this is what my sleep patterns were. And then now if you say, since that year, here's how my sleep patterns have changed, it's probably a grief reaction. The same would be true of most of these symptoms. You may have experienced headaches, or feelings of guilt, and or sad relief, etc., confusion, forgetfulness. Maybe you say, I experienced some of that prior to. Well, but if there's been an increase or a change in these symptoms since your loss, it's probably grief related. And the good news about that, those symptoms can be aired, and there is relief for these grief symptoms we experience. Other common reactions: sensitivity to environmental factors, and that could be both physical and emotional. And I think you, all of us, are familiar with some of the what I call extreme reactions to politics. We've always had elections in our country, and people always lose. It seems like people in some circles have been more sensitive and tended to overreact. Well, that is a common grief reaction. Strained relationships, this sense of vulnerability and unreality, all of these are common grief symptoms. And these are, I think, as we take notice of these symptoms and look at them in relation to our loss, or the year that 2020 was, it could indicate, and it'll probably indicate, that, okay, this is grief related. Difficulty making decisions, withdrawing from social activities, and so on. These are common. So if you're experiencing any of these or have experienced them since the pandemic, these are common. Nothing is wrong with you. It's just grief, and the grief can be mourned, which will create a reduction of symptoms and enhanced functioning. Again, more common grief reactions. I could probably spend time talking about all of these. I'll only highlight the disenfranchised grief and give a simple example of that. So losses that people have experienced 2020 and 2021 that were not COVID related have sometimes been and often been disenfranchised. So an example of that might be, and I've met with families and people who lost a loved one during the pandemic, not due to COVID. And so those people have often shared, it seems like that their loss was minimized, or sometimes they felt a sense of guilt in talking about their loss because my neighbor, friend, coworker, etc., is grieving the loss of someone from the pandemic. Well, disenfranchised grief, or those losses we experience that we are not free or free to mourn or have validated, create and enhance and frustrate the grief response. Few myths about it, because I do want to kind of end on what works. So how do you deal with it? How do you manage grief? How do you work through grief? A couple of myths. Strong person should be able to get through without showing emotions. It's a myth. If we don't express our grief through emotions, it'll come out in behavior, as you noticed in some of the symptoms. This timetable here, you should be able to go back to normal after 2 or 3 months, or grief gets easier. All of those are common myths about grief. The idea that grief proceeds through predictable and orderly stages. Myth. There's nothing orderly or predictable about the process. However, there are things that are common and inherent in grief, but to say it proceeds in an orderly way, that's not how that works. Common myths about grief. Again, I like this picture. Picture, they say, worth 1,000 words. This family has just, and this is what you'll call a living loss. This was after the hurricane. They lost their home, and what was left of it was the steps. And so imagine the mix of emotions with this living loss. They have each other. They're still alive, but things like photographs and other possessions that they've had were all damaged. Again, a living loss. And it creates that same type of grief response. Experts said during Hurricane Katrina that the survivors and those who had gone through that indicated that the mental health impact would linger for years to come. And we know that that's true of this pandemic environment. Now, these are the 4 tasks of mourning. This is a framework, not me or a writer saying this is the orderly way grief progresses. But this is a framework. And so the theory says that a person needs to work through these 4 things in order to move to healing and mourn that grief. So accepting the reality of what was lost, process that pain, adjust to a world without the deceased or without what was lost, and find a way to connect with and remember what we had as we move forward. So those 4 tasks are the framework that we use, and practical ways to do that. So how do you cope with living losses? Number 1, controlling the things that you can control. When you recognize and realize the things that are beyond your control, let go. Do what you can to put boundaries and let go of those things. And I like to use the airline safety briefing. I remember the first time that I'd flown with my children when they were younger, and then the stewardess said, yeah, if you're traveling with a small child. Now, I've heard the briefing again and again, but it stood out to me when I was traveling with my children. And so it said something like, if you're traveling with a small child and the cabin loses air pressure, an oxygen mask will drop from the ceiling. Then it said, secure your own oxygen mask first, and then take care of the person you're with, something like that. And I remember thinking initially, not going to happen. If we lose oxygen pressure, I'm going to take care of my child and make sure he's safe and he's okay first. But then I started thinking about it. Why would they say that? Why would they tell a parent or a caregiver to take care of yourself first? And then it made sense. Because if something as the caregiver were to happen to me, and I black out, then my child is more vulnerable. And so this is the same principle. Control the things that you can. Take care of yourself first. Slow down where you have to. Get support where you need it. And then the acronym HALT, which is used often for addiction and other disorders. If you are hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, those make you vulnerable. They make us vulnerable to grief and those grief responses. And so when you catch yourself in those places, do something about it. Where you get your information, and this is in your handout as well, a key part of controlling the things that you can are the routines. These are easy to neglect, but very helpful in managing and coping with living loss. Few other pointers. I won't read through all of them, but I will just highlight a couple of things that are significant for mourning or externalizing grief. And so that's bullet point number 2, acknowledging your feelings, finding a safe place, friends, supportive people where you can talk openly and not be judged or censored about the things you feel. Not necessarily that the problems are solved, but being able to air those things out is a key ingredient for healing and self-care and coping. But all of these are key points for coping with loss, living loss. On this slide, the one that I will comment on, well, actually there are a couple. So the very first bullet point, nurturing yourself. This is huge. Work can be a distraction, and the tasks and projects we have can be a good distraction at times. But don't neglect to nurture yourself, the things that build you up and that are meaningful to you, to build those into your life. And then the other thing that I think is really in the second bullet point from the bottom that I'd like to highlight, those things that drain you, relationships, if watching the news drains you, if social media leaves you in a bad place, limit those things. This is a part of coping with living loss. And so as I wrap this up, one of my favorite bereavement quotes, grief changes us. The pain sculpts us. So the losses that we experience and have experienced don't have to, there are positives, I'll say it that way. There can be positive things that we derive from loss. And so these are a few. Understanding others more deeply, the capacity to hurt more often, to appreciate the things that we do have, giving yourself permission to emote, to cry, and then to hope and love. So I am going to end my my presentation there. If there are, I don't know if there might be some questions or comments. Thank you so much for the courtesy of your attention. And again, take care of yourselves.
So thank you so much, David. We appreciate all of that information. I know that I feel a little bit better, that I'm not the only one that is going through some of those symptoms. I certainly noticed that a number of those are things that I've experienced over the past year. And I'm sure that the others on the call today have also felt that way. Are there any questions that you would like to ask to David? You can simply post those in the chat box, or you can raise your hand. There's a little hand in your toolbar. If you click on that, I can open up your microphone and allow you to talk and to ask that question. We'd be happy to take a couple questions this time. Don't everybody ask them at once. So the handouts and the copy of the PowerPoint that David mentioned, those are items that I will share with you in a post follow-up to today's meeting. So everyone that is registered on today's call will receive a copy of those things for reference. And the program is being recorded and will be posted on orrvillesafety.com. So you have that for reference as well. All right, so I'm going to see if I can share my screen again, and we'll just wrap things up today. All right. So again, next week, Orrville Moves. The Orrville Safety Council is the sponsor for that. So I encourage you to get out and have some movement. If you've not registered for Orrville Moves, you can do that online. Altman Orrville Hospital has a link on their website, or you can visit the Orrville Public Library, the Orrville YMCA, Orrville Sports and Wellness, Zephyr's Fitness, any of those locations in the community. You can sign up for Orrville Moves. And then July 28th will be the net walking activity at the YMCA and University of Akron Wayne College. So I invite you to come out and join us for a morning walk and get some steps in that way. So as an announcement for next month, the Orrville Safety Council webinar on August 11th will be a Northeast Ohio cyber threat update. This is a program that everyone that does anything with computers, which is every single one of us, if you use the internet or anything, this is a very important program for everyone to hear. We have a cybersecurity expert, Daniel Falsetto, or I butchered his last name. I apologize for that. We'll get that right for next week. He's with Sophos, which is a partner with Polito Consulting. Polito is a chamber member. They're located in Wadsworth, and they will have some information about programs and services that their company offers to local businesses to help minimize cybersecurity threats. Just this past month, the chamber had a phishing incident with our email. One of our staff members had their email hacked. So it can happen to anybody, and we do want to just make sure that everyone is very aware of what threats are out there and can take the appropriate steps to protect themselves. You don't have to be a large business to have a cybersecurity breach or a ransomware or any of those kinds of things that are out there. So I hope that you will join us next month for that very important program. And again, I want to say thank you to Ohio's Hospice Lifecare and to David Hargrave for sharing with us today, giving us some things to think about and to share with our employees as we are all dealing with different emotions and feelings as we have come through and continue to deal with things related to the pandemic. So again, thank you so much for your participation in the Orrville Area Safety Council, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Have a great day.